Hello, everyone. Thank you for checking out this special episode of Really Dicey. This is Manny, and I am here with David Larkins, Pendragon line editor for Chaosium. And today we're going to talk about Pendragon Gamemaster's Handbook. First things first, David, how are you?
Doing pretty well, Manny. Thanks for having me.
And thank you for taking time to talk about this really interesting book. So, when it comes to Game Master's handbooks or any type of Dungeon
Hmm.
Master or Game Master's guides in general,
Yeah.
I always get a little worried of what I'm going to be reading because Dungeon Master's guides, especially, I feel like books like that half of it tends to be about like the very beginner level of how to role play or what a role playing game is, and then most times you just go back to it just for that little section about either magic spells or magic items and so forth.
Hmm.
But I was really looking forward to Pendragon Game Master's Handbook because I was hoping that this book will help me uh, give me the tools I need so that when I run this game, I could give that feeling that Arthurian feel
Hmm.
to my players. And from looking at this, haven't read this through, but looking at this, it looks like it does exactly what I wanted to do, which I'm very excited about. It looks completely useful. uh,
Good.
if I may ask, I don't think there's been a Game Master's Handbook before for Pendragon.
Hmm.
If I may ask, what led to the creation of this book?
Basically, what we had to make a decision early on in the process of deciding how we were going to publish sixth edition, and that even goes back to when Greg Stafford was first working on his initial drafts, and he would sort of sometimes he would say, oh well, it should be three different books, and other times it was like, well, it should be two different books. There was never an idea that it would just be one gigantic book, because that would be uh, just prohibitively expensive, and people would see this like 700 page monster, right? Just say, oh, I'm not running that, right?
Mhm.
So we ended up going with Greg's initial model of 3 volumes, to kind of encompass all of the core rules of the game. Now we have the core rule book, which is literally like everything you need to play the game, make characters, and so forth. And like you could certainly you could run something just using that book. If you're just doing like knights, kind of fighting other knights. But it's also, you get a scenario, or um, you pick up the Great Pendragon campaign. The core rule book is literally all you need to play those. So that all went into that book. And then we have the Game Master's Handbook, which is number 2. Number 3 is the Noble's Handbook. Game Master's Handbook is the toolkit, sort of like what you're saying, where, okay, I'm a game master, I'm running Pendragon. Um, I want to have all the tools available to me to write my own scenarios, to improvise off of written scenarios or what have you, to add additional content, maybe that sort of thing, and to understand the world better. So it's a more in-depth look at Arthurian Britain, through the chapters on religion and magic, and even just sort of inferring it from the Arthurian Acts chapter on tournaments and hunting and feasting and that sort of thing. So it just allows us to get way more in depth in a way that the page count on the core rulebook unfortunately didn't allow us to do. But again, we wanted the game to be accessible and not necessarily just this massive brick that only a few people were going to buy.
And I love that stuff that really game masters should really focus on is directly in this book.
Hmm.
This makes it easier for me so that I could keep certain things like the bestiary and other
Hmm.
things away from players and learning too many of my secrets.
Right.
Um, um, so I love that this is still keeping with the theme of the design and the art style. This cover, is this Lancelot and his
Hmm.
aunt before he goes to Arthurian court?
Yes, it's Vivian of the Lake, and she's presenting him with his enchanted shield that he's going to take with him when he goes to present himself at Camelot.
Now, I love that because it kind of gives at least gives me the feel that okay, you can almost like start fresh, start new, and take your own and create your own version of these Arthurian
Mm,
tales.
yeah.
Was that the idea behind the cover? Was that what you're going for?
Yeah, absolutely. We kind of like, so for the core rule book we have Gawain and the Green Knight, and that's like Gawain's kind of the center of the cover there because he's a player character, right? So it's like he's the one who's interacting with this mysterious knight who's come into the court. Here, Vivian's the center of focus, right? And so she's effectively the game master, right? She's kind of saying like, here's your quest, here's your enchanted item that will help you in your quest, and now you can go forth and be awesome.
And there's a lot of great art in this book. My favorite one is actually kind of early on. If I may
Mm.
share this with you, it's probably the most gorgeous Lady of the Lake like art pieces I've ever
Mm.
seen.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
that's phenomenal. I mean, I'm assuming that's Lady of the Lake.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's Loic Muzi, who, he's they're keeping him pretty busy with Call of Cthulhu and RuneQuest, but I
Hmm.
tried to snag him as much as I could. Like, hey, you got enough time to do like one piece for me? So, and yeah, I said, yeah, can you do a Lady of the Lake and maybe just have some of these elements in it? And he produces this. I'm like, yeah, okay, nailed it in one. Thank you.
Hmm.
Amazing.
As line editor, if I may ask,
Hmm.
how do you select the art pieces you want? Do you
Hmm.
kind of reach out to the artist and say, "Hey, listen, Lady of the Lake, give me something," or
Yeah.
how does that work exactly? How do you choose?
Yeah, it's been an interesting process because, when I came on board as line editor, I sort of had certain ideas of what I was going to do as part of my job, obviously editing and, maybe writing some original material as needed and doing some mechanics designs as needed or cleanup or whatever. But the art direction has actually been like the most pleasant surprise for me because um, I don't know. I mean, my dad's an artist, and so I grew up in a very art focused household, and I've always had opinions on RPG
Hmm.
art and like, oh, I love this guy, and this person's like, oh, I wish they hadn't used him as much, and as they did, and whatever. We all have opinions. Art is subjective, right? Um, so it's been a lot of fun to have an opportunity, both operating sort of in my own capacity and also working with Sim Cogswell and the other like people on the design team who we all work together to come up with the overall vision for the how the books are going to look. But yeah, when it comes to individual illustrations, usually like we have these sort of rules of thumb. You want sort of like the equivalent of a full page of art for every like 4 pages of text, let's say, and that could be like 2 half pages or whatever. So when I'm going through the manuscript, I'll kind of look for like the parts of the book that, oh, it's been a little bit since we've had some art. Let's put something in here, and then I'll kind of look for like what's around that section of text, and then uh, start to conceptualize something. And it's a very odd experience, right? Because you're like, okay, now I need to imagine a drawing. I need to imagine a piece of art that doesn't exist. So, it's like this act of creation, right? And so, but I'll use the like I said, I'll use what's going on in the text as a jumping off point, and then I am familiar with the art that's appeared in Pendragon editions up to this point. And so sometimes I'll think, like in this instance, we've never had a really great full page Lady of the Lake illustration. We've had some good ones of like maybe half page, black and white, but full color, boom, Lady of the Lake, like let's do it. Let's get one in here in this section that's talking about magic in Britain, or where I forget exactly where that is, but it is titled in some way. Um and yeah, so that can also inform, like I'll try to like think of things that maybe we haven't shown in Pendragon in the past, or that maybe I've wished for. So for example, with the Noble's Handbook, we have like a big section on like wealth and trade with like a bunch of extra like um you know equipment and other material items, right? That sort of builds off of what's in the core rule book. And so, like, I commissioned actually Mark Smiley, who did the cover here, to do like a full page of like a baron and a baroness in the Boy King era, in their like best courtly garb, And then there's like little like blow up insets, like showing like signet ring or belt pouch or whatever, like kind of showing it in more detail. So like people can just look at that and go, oh, okay, that's what they're talking about when they are talking about this particular type of clothing or this particular type of accoutrement or whatever.
So before I talk to you about the chapters in this
Mhm.
book and what they contain, um, for anyone that's familiar already with Pendragon and they're curious about, okay, what is in here that I haven't seen before?
Mm.
Is there anything in here that you think that may surprise them or interest them?
We go into more detail, I think, on like the setting than maybe they're accustomed to reading, like including like the different religions, the different like magical practices, and the folklore. Right, like we have all these sidebars on like dwarfs in Arthurian literature and giants in Arthurian literature and allegorical animals, and so there's a lot more detail about the setting here than they would have seen in previous Pendragon rule books, or maybe it would have been more scattered across different supplements and scenarios and that kind of thing. So it's all gathered together here in one place. But also, we have the new battle system, which is there's a sort of streamlined version of that in the starter set, but this is the full thing, which includes like if you want to run your own battles, like if you have a player knight who's a baron and he's leading an army, you can play that out, see what happens, right? The feast rules are adapted from the Book of Feasts, but again, updated, streamlined, and now officially part of the core rules. And then just a lot of like a lot of those small changes. Tournaments work a little differently. There's some additional detail for tournament prizes, and like there's a jousting table and that kind of thing. So much like people would ask like, well, what changed from 5th edition to 6th edition? I'd say like, well, there's a lot of small changes. There's nothing radical, right? But there's just a lot of small changes that are going to make the game feel a little different in a good way. And in the same sense, like I think if you're a longtime Pendragon Gamemaster, you're going to find a lot of just great little Easter eggs throughout the book, right? That there's like are going to improve your game or add some extra detail that you didn't know you were missing.
So the first section, the fabled realm, is that the would you say that's the introduction into the world of King Arthur?
Yeah, it's sort of an expanded chapter. The core rule book has a sort of bird's eye view of the setting, and then this is where we start to get into more detail. So we have like a fairly detailed overview of the political situation in Britain and the customs, and we get into like the literary inspirations for how the game depicts Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, but also like sort of emphasizing like, hey, if you like the sort of more historical approach, or if you like the German romances like Parzival more than say Mallory, here's how they differ, and here's some like other works that you could check out if you wanted to maybe give your game a slightly different flavor, that kind of thing. So, oh, and that also has one of my favorite little rules, which is Paragons of Knighthood, which is if you're running like say a one-on-one campaign, you just have one player knight, and you want them to be like a Lancelot or a Percival. This just has some brief but effective guidelines on how to kind of start out the character a little overpowered, right? But like as a compensation for the fact that they're going to be the ones dealing with everything, as opposed to having a group of player knights sort of splitting the effort, right?
Running Pendragon. Now, before you talk about the setting
Mm-hmm.
some more,
Mm-hmm.
maybe a point of clarification. When I talk to like when I go to conventions and I
Mm-hmm.
mention I have an interest in running Pendragon,
Mm.
and again my experience right now is the new edition that is out. Um, Especially when I talk to like players that have played the previous editions of Pendragon,
Mm.
they keep giving me like different. They keep asking me about what take I'm doing with Pendragon? Is it gonna be like super historical or fantastic, um, and like a variations of the two? How would you describe the setting of Pendragon? Would you say it's uh, I'll let you answer. Sorry.
No worries. So I mean, the foundational text that Greg started with was Le Mort d'Arthur, Thomas Mallory, and that provides the sort of skeleton for the overall plot of how things progress, and the characters that are going to be showing up a lot as in the stories and the lore. But he even says there's a annotated bibliography at the end of this Game Master's Handbook, and he says, you might actually just want to start, if you want to read like one book of Arthurian lore, read The Once and Future King by T.H. White, because it's written for a modern audience. It has modern sensibilities throughout, and it's a good book. It's classic literature, right? So it's that kind of, I don't know what we would call that, sort of baseline Arthuriana, I guess, right? The Sword and the Stone and Merlin and the Round Table, Lancelot, Mordred, Guinevere, Morgan Le Fay. It's probably a little bit more on the fantasy and folkloric side than it is on the historical side. And it can be easy to get sort of lost in the weeds of like either Dark Ages history or like trying to replicate medieval history. And that was something Greg would, grapple with even himself. Like he'd go into, reading all these deep scholarly works on like, Norman property law in the 12th century and that kind of thing. Um, but that's like, you can run Pendragon, your whole life and never crack open a book on that level of scholarship. You can go that direction if it's interesting to you, of course, but yeah, it's sort of like Mallory onwards. And then there's the alternate approach, which is kind of taking Mallory as the capstone of all these medieval romances that came before, that he was sort of collating and turning into this like, omnibus epic, right? And so if you want your game to feel a little bit more like these medieval romances, which oftentimes felt very um, almost like hallucinogenic in a certain way, where it's like you're just riding around in this sort of vaguely defined realm, and there's knights guarding crossroads, and there's ladies with the grail who just show up out of nowhere, and there's not a lot of rhyme or reason. So if you just want that kind of vibe, you could take it in that direction. And then yeah, there's the people who like the sort of Dark Ages Arthur, the Bernard Cornwell, Winter King kind of stuff. And I'd say Pendragon is actually like you'd have to do a lot of work to get to have your Pendragon feel like that. I'm not saying you can't do it. You would just have to strip out a lot of the elements, I think, that are in the game in order to give it a more grounded feel, because really it is this kind of like um, yeah, sort of dreamlike at times sort of game.
Sorry, I'm diverging a little bit from this discussion about the book itself,
Mm-hmm.
but it occurred to me that Stafford, there's so many few game designers that have stuck to their games for such a long period of time. Even Gygax had stopped that first
Sure.
edition AD&D.
Sure.
It must have been fascinating to like read like as a line editor, look at the original works and see the changes in his style, his philosophy,
Mm-hmm.
his knowledge of his understanding of history, and
Mm-hmm.
the creation of these books. Sorry, it's not really a question. It's just I don't know. That must be really cool.
It is, and you can even trace that through the published works. Like there was a period there in like, I want to say like the around 2010s, where he was playing around with this idea, and it shows up in a couple of the fifth edition supplements, like the sort of latter supplements, where he was playing around with this idea of like divorcing all the place names from their sort of modern equivalents. So like, you might go to Canterbury, for example, right? Like in Pendragon, there's a location called Canterbury, or there's a location, called uh, I don't know. I'm trying to think of another Saxon name, because basically what he what he wanted to do was strip out all of the sort of Saxon place names in England, of which there are many, because it is England, right? But he didn't want to go full like Welsh, where everything was sort of written in this, either Welsh or sort of archaic Celtic kind of form. So he was just like, okay, what was this place name before it became Stafford, for example, or whatever, right? What was the original place name? Oh, it was this Celtic word that meant blah. It meant, Swallow's Nest Hill or something, right? And he'd be like, okay, so that place name is called Swallow's Nest Hill now. It's not. It's no longer called Stafford. And you can just see like how he was kind of getting into this particular direction, like what we're talking about in terms of alternate Arthurian Britons, where he's like, I want this to feel super dreamlike. I want this to feel like it's not a land that's influenced by any of the subsequent history that came afterwards. And my position on that was always like, well, I like in Arthurian fantasy where it talks about real place names like Oxford or whatever, because that grounds it. It's already dreamlike enough, but then, oh, they're visiting a real place, so that's cool. So that brings you back over to the reality side, and eventually he came back around on that as well. So Greg was one of those designers. He did this with RuneQuest too, where he was never afraid to like just kind of go back in and get under the hood and start like pulling parts out and throwing them around and sticking other things in, and let's just see what works. And sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. And but he very much thought sixth edition was like, going to be like his ultimate version, where he's just like, this is it, this is what I'm settling on. So I'm glad he got a chance at least to give us that.
And going back to the book, Running Pendragon, again, it's only 8 pages.
Mm-hmm.
If I may ask, what can readers expect from this chapter?
So yeah, it's 8 pages, but it's pretty packed. I think it's got Greg's own advice in terms of uh, how to run the game, which is actually about half the chapter, I think. And then we've just got some guidelines for GMs in terms of like, here's when you should call for a dexterity roll, here's when you should call for a strength roll, here's how to use appearance in the game, that kind of thing. And then just like, yeah, setting up the campaign in terms of Pendragon being this game where you have like one adventure per year. How does that work? How does that play out in the campaign where you're going over like multiple game years? And and then also like, how does that work in the setting, like in terms of holidays and seasons and that sort of thing, with like, when do knights go adventuring versus when are they expected to be back serving their lords, and that sort of thing.
Arthurian acts. Before I ask you to talk about this chapter, I haven't read this thoroughly, but I did stop the seducing someone at court section, just
Mm.
because I've had scenarios where players want to romance non-playable characters, and
Mhm,
I had to
mhm,
figure out how to role play that situation.
mhm,
And reading this, for some reason, it gave me the feeling of Shakespearean plays,
mm,
or plays like it. Um, uh, for those not sure what I'm talking about, there's a lot of morality in the old plays where if someone did something wrong,
mm.
even if they're the hero of the story, they have to pay for it in some way,
Yeah,
and that's what this section reminds me of. Yeah, you can seduce someone at court, but there's a penalty, well, not a penalty, but there's a
mm,
price to pay
yeah,
for that.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
absolutely. It's all about the consequences.
yes, yes. So, Arthurian X, yes, it's full of very interesting items. But let you talk about this chapter.
Sure. So yeah, this is in a lot of ways, I think this is kind of the heart of the book, because one of the challenges, I guess, with running Pendragon is like the mechanics themselves are going to drive the play in certain directions, which is great. But you also, as the game master, you want to be able to present the setting and the game in a way that is going to get player buy-in. So, like, for example, a big one that is always an issue for me is getting players used to the idea, because normally in any other role-playing game, the idea of your player character getting captured, and held captive by your enemy is like the last thing you're going to want to do. You're going to fight to the death before you allow that to happen. So there's actually a section discussing how captivity is this like major trope of Arthurian literature, and that's backed up in the game as well, because knights have ransom value, so it's actually in everyone's best interest to capture your opponent rather than kill them, because that way you can make some money off of it, right? But once you've been captured and once you're being held captive, what does that look like? And it can be everything from being thrown into a dungeon to just being kind of a genial guest at the court while you're waiting for your ransom to be paid, or even being allowed out on parole, like on the promise that your ransom will be paid. But we have some little scenario hooks that we throw in at the end of that section, just to get the game master's creative mind turning, in terms of like, captivity is actually a way to move the story forward rather than the end of the story, or it's going to bring the plot to a screeching halt or whatever.
Mm. And again, I love the little things in here, like intoxication. You have a section about that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Visiting a foreign court, I I like that section a lot, because I've already heard ideas from my players who are wanting to run or play this game,
Mm-hmm.
about like where they want to visit, and like what will be, if they're from France and they want to visit the courts in France, how would that
Mm-hmm.
work? Um, which in my mind, I'm like, okay, I gotta do some homework. But I saw this section, like, okay, good. There's a place in this book where I can kind of start my foundation.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Yeah,
but
that's another one of those ones where it's like we're trying to facilitate an understanding of like some fairly well, no pun intended, some fairly foreign concepts, right? Where like this idea of having to present yourself at the Lord's castle before you can do anything else really in his lands. The idea of like hospitality and like the sort of give and take of that, and if you're in sort of a friendly territory versus an unfriendly territory, how's that going to differ? What can you expect? What's a sign of like a good host versus someone who just wants to kind of move you on your way as quickly as possible by being kind
mm.
of rude, right? So
The next section, religion.
mhm.
Um, Two things real fast. I love that paganism and heathenism are included in this.
Mm,
Um, and Christianity. I did peek a little bit into that, and I it's in today's age. It's um, oh man, how can I say this without being too controversial? Um, but I don't know, something about this section reminds me of like the ideals of
mm,
what good religion can do.
yeah.
And I think I sidestepped that. But I like that, and I like that, like those, like these this very, again, there's a very strong morality involved in this game, where
Mm,
um your characters, they're honorable, they're noble. It's almost in a way a variation of like some of the like some Legend of Five Rings, where that honor is
mm,
also very important, or
yeah.
Klingons in Star Trek, where honor is also very important.
Hmm.
So to see that there, I know, reading it, I thought I enjoyed that section.
Hmm.
But again, I'm sorry, I don't want to talk over you.
Oh
What can
no.
you tell us about this chapter?
Well, I think the main thing about this chapter is that people might be a little surprised by how long it is. I mean, it's 40 pages, you know, and and that's mainly because, like what you're saying, is like to the medieval mind, your religious beliefs were kind of, where like the modern mind is concerned with like patriotism or nationalism or political beliefs, left wing, right wing, whatever. The medieval mind, it was all about your belief system, your religious beliefs, your spirituality, and how much you measured up to the ideals. I mean, the Grail quest is all about that, right? It is literally about how most of the knights of Arthur's court are, as valorous and famous as they are not worthy of the Grail, and how they fall short of those ideals. And Pendragon, as a general game, is all about that. It's the conflict of your sort of like personal motivations versus your ideals of chivalry or religion or what have you. So we just felt it was, I mean, this is all Greg, right? But we agree that with Greg that this was an opportunity to really dive in and give a very comprehensive view of Christianity, paganism, heathenism, and Wodenism, so that game masters can understand at least how to play the non-player characters, right? And why it's important, and how a lot of these belief systems sort of align and how they conflict, and what does that mean. And then we also, of course, get into the sort of practicalities of it, like here are the holy people who are currently living in Britain, the saints or the druids or the ladies of the lake. These are the holy days of this religion. That sort of thing that would actually like fit into, again, if you're designing a scenario or you just want to throw in some extra color to an existing scenario.
Mm. And what can you tell us about it looks like you have like pagan religious night, the
Mm-hmm.
heathen religious night, the Waldonic religious night. What can you tell us about that as well?
So that was one of Greg's sort of concessions to modern readership, right? So like there's 20th century literature that influences Pendragon, as well as the older materials, and so things like the Mists of Avalon, for example, the Merlin trilogy, these sorts of things that sort of were like, hey, what if we, looked at the Arthurian legends from the perspective of the pagan, the sort of, native pagan religion that was in Britain before Christianity came, that is sort of represented by the Ladies of the Lake, by Merlin, these characters. And so Greg, included these alternate faith systems because, I mean, he was a mythologist. He loved studying different, faith systems, different belief systems. And so I think for him, it was also just an opportunity to have that kind of like multifaceted view of beliefs in the setting. And a lot of modern players appreciate being able to play a pagan knight, and have that kind of belief system going.
Magic and miracles, the next
Mm-hmm.
chapter. Let's talk a little bit about that. How does for those that are not familiar with magic in Pendragon,
Mm-hmm.
um, it's how does it differ for, let's say they only know Dungeons and Dragons for magic.
Yeah.
How does it differ?
Well, so first of all, and speaking, this chapter follows the religion chapter for good reason, because we've discussed all these faith systems, and now we're going to discuss where, like, how the magic of those faith systems manifest, because that's magic in Pendragon, is like a manifestation of the belief systems of the magician, right? But we include in magic, we also include miracles. So there's no Christian magic, but there's Christian miracles. A saint can call for divine protection or divine retribution, whereas like a pagan magician, like a druid, might weave an enchantment or cast a glamour that would change the physical environment, or heal somebody of their mortal wounds or what have you. And then like the Wodinic magic of the Saxons is more about like, runecraft and controlling the weather and that kind of thing. So that, it differs by faith system. And, we give some guidelines for how to approach magic in terms of like what are individual magicians or saints or whoever capable of. But really, it is fundamentally up to the game master, because the point of view of the players is knights. They're not magicians. They don't know how this stuff works. So you know, ultimately it's for the game masters. We don't have spell list in this book, at least. you
Mm.
know, so
Would you say then that like magic is more like, or magic and miracles are more like, I would say like Lord of the Rings, where it's not,
mhm.
not everyone. It's not like your mage level one type of thing, but it's more like uh, magic is both common and rare. Like the
Mhm.
magic is real, miracles are real,
Yeah.
but no one's in town knows the fireball spell, for example.
Right. It's like those old debates about like what level of magic user was Gandalf, and or Gandalf was a fourth level magic user, fifth level cleric, or whatever. It's just like no, 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 that's not. Like, yeah, magicians are just this kind of separate thing. They're intended to be mysterious, and the game master is given like considerable latitude in terms of like what they're able to do. And again, that's part of like making the setting your own. So it could, you could dial it all the way down to like magic and miracles are just coincidences, or magicians are just using cheap stage tricks and that sort of thing to get one over on the gullible. But and then you could go all the way to the other end, where saints are calling for divine intervention, and Merlin is transporting entire armies overnight, and the stuff that you see more commonly in like Mallory and older sources like that.
Mm. The next chapter, battle.
Mm-hmm.
On the table of contents, when I first saw it, it looked like a huge chapter, but it's actually um, about 25 or a little bit
Mm-hmm.
over 25 pages.
Mm-hmm.
It has a lot of sections, a lot of information in that chapter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What can you tell us about it?
So I sort of alluded earlier to having to be a game designer as well as a writer and an editor, and the battle chapter was the big one for me, because Greg hadn't quite worked out what he wanted sixth edition battle system to look like, and he had never been entirely happy with any of the battle systems in Pendragon up to that point. And so, taking his notes as a jumping off point, I worked with Jeff Richard and my development team, and we decided to design a battle system that focuses the action on what the player knights are experiencing on the field, rather than worrying about tactics and command responsibilities, unless that happens to be the role that the player knight is taking. But that's pretty rare. Most of the time you're just part of your little band of brothers, and you're on the field, and all you're concerned with is like, who's this enemy in front of me? Or, oh my god, my friend just went mad and like rushed off into battle on his own, and he's taking on this whole unit of knights by himself. We gotta go save him and drag him off the field. Or oh, I've just captured this high ranking knight, I need to get him to the rear before he escapes. These sorts of like personal stories that are playing out on the battlefield while these bigger armies are clashing, right?
Game master characters. I,
Mm-hmm.
this chapter, I am surprised
Mm.
um, that we have stats now for like King Arthur and a lot of these major characters,
Yeah.
and only because I'm sure you heard this. If something has stats, players will want to kill it.
Very
But
true. True.
what I really love about this, and I see this also in the bestiary as well, the way the stats and
Mm.
information are organized, I
Mm.
love that so much because I can print that. I
Yeah.
can I could cut it up with scissors if I want and
Yeah.
have it behind my GM screen, and I have like everything I need. I know the stats, what they can do,
Yeah.
the skill checks. That's just great organization in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, like you say, it presents a bunch of named characters, both like the major ones like Arthur, Guinevere, Merlin, and then also like the locally important characters that are part of the the core rule book. You're making knights from Salisbury County, so we present the Count of Salisbury, Sir Robert. We present Dame Aspera, who's kind of his mentor, and the knight who trains all the player knights as well. And these are characters who show up later. We'll get to the scenarios chapter, but they show up in the scenarios. And then after that, yeah, we just provide as many stat blocks as we could cram in, for like general allies and enemies, really. I mean, everything from different varieties of knight to different, Saxons, berserkers, of course, spearmen, crossbowmen, and that's there again as like part of that toolkit, where as the game master you can say, okay, I'm going to take this veteran spearman stat block and turn this into like a named NPC and maybe change a few things, but this is sort of my base that I'm working from.
The next chapter, Bestiary,
Mm-hmm.
um, animals and creatures of all sorts. Um, I I hope I'm not gonna jump the gun in a sense and assume, but
Mm.
it looks like yeah. There's unicorns and there's dwarves, and
Mm-hmm.
of course maybe you've seen them tons of different places and different role playing games,
Mm.
but it looks like you're taking these creatures that we're very familiar with and then putting a different spin on them to fit
Mm.
not only the Arthurian lore, but just uh, more like I guess you could say more of the classical lore as well. Um,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
am I correct about that, or?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, we leaned in even more on that kind of like folkloric underpinning, and also like medieval cosmology, right? Because in medieval cosmology, anything that was not of the natural world was either a fairy or a fiend. And so, unicorns and goblins and that sort of thing, those are fairies. But so are basilisks and dragons, right? They're these spirits that have essentially taken material form in the form of one of these strange beasts, and then you have this, fiendish um, manifestations as well, which are, sort of tricksters, diabolical tricksters who can't directly harm you, but they can trick you into thinking that you've been harmed, or they can trick you into like doing harm to others. And so like we were trying to like integrate cosmology, spirituality, belief systems. The allegorical animals section is one of my favorites because you can get trait checks by watching animals in the wild, and this is based on medieval bestiaries and how they would write about um, the lion, like the way a lion was, and it was some kind of allegory for a morality tale, basically, right?
And again, the bestiary section used to have the block stats. The way you
Mm.
organized it, it's so I'm so happy with that.
That's
Um,
great. I'm glad to hear that.
so yes, I know you already talked a little bit about this scenarios.
Yeah, these are designed to like essentially function as campaign launch pads. You've taken your players through making characters in the core rulebook, and it's setting them up with a certain background, and certain assumptions of like what year is it, political situation, etc. These are the scenarios that jump off of that core rulebook introduction, and frankly could be retooled pretty easily to any other point in the Boy King period, because they're having to do with fighting Saxons, and that sort of very volatile political situation that Arthur essentially comes in and helps resolve. But it also introduces a lot of local politics, local characters. There's rivals and allies that get set up, um, and there's also just kind of a the first scenario in particular is intended to kind of, if you've never run Pendragon before and you don't have the starter set, here's how you run Pendragon. But we even have a little sidebar on how to integrate these scenarios with the starter set with the Grey Knight. So
Mm.
tried to make it as cross referenced as possible.
And last but not least, you have the appendix section.
Mm-hmm.
Two appendixes: glory awards for knights and ladies, and suggested reading.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Um, anything? What, if I may ask? What's your favorite aspects of these appendixes, if I may?
Well, the Glory Awards appendix is great because it's the most I think it's the most comprehensive overview of examples for awarding glory that's ever been in a Pendragon rulebook. Because it's just sort of a collation of all the different sources for glory awards that have appeared in previous publications, and it's sort of, there's a unified guideline for like passive glory from your standard of living and that sort of thing. So we're trying to get everything kind of dialed in a consistent way. It's like how the economics work, and how does that interface with the glory that you get from being, say, a banneret or an estate holder or a baron or whatever.
Hmm.
But really, it's the suggested reading appendix that I love because, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's a annotated bibliography. These are literally books that were in Greg Stafford's library that he consulted all the time, not just books, but also manuscripts, online resources, that sort of thing. And yeah, he includes his notes on why these books were important for the design of the game. Like, he talks about as he says here, the Castles of England. This is one of two books that I consider to be a definitive source on castles for Pendragon. So like, if you're wondering, what influenced Greg Stafford in designing the game, this appendix is going to tell you probably everything you need to know.
So yeah, this is a little bit close to 240 pages. It looks amazing. I can't wait to read this more thoroughly. Is there anything else about it that I haven't asked you about that you wanted to share?
Let's see. Well, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that, and you sort of alluded to part of this. With the battle chapter, we have a full slate of like encounters and opportunities. So, the starter set again presented a sort of tone cut down version of that, but for battle we have everything you could possibly want for a typical battle, lots of opportunities, and then likewise we have it's not part of the book itself, but we do have a little QR code that will take you to a free PDF for feast event cards, which you can print out, cut up, and use at your table, or if you run online, even better, right?
Hmm.
And we will eventually offer print on demand decks for feast cards and battle encounters and opportunities. So this kind of
Hmm.
sets that up, and then a little bit down the line we'll have physical options for that. But in the meantime, we wanted to give folks means to kind of create their own. So like, I have mine right here. There it is, my little feast deck with the card sleeves, and there's the
Hmm.
cards, right? So um, easily done, easily created, and you know, would have liked to include it at the back, but it would have been 10 extra pages. And when you're at 240 pages, like every page counts, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Real fast.
Hmm.
For those that are not familiar what feast events are,
Hmm.
how would you describe that?
So, yeah, so feast events are another, or feasts, I should say, are another part of the Arthurian Acts chapter. And, this is like, for a long time, Pendragon didn't have a mechanism for playing out feasts, but it had like mechanisms for hunting and tournaments, which are sort of the other two big events that outside of battle and questing, most knights are going to be concerned with. So, one of the first things I did for the line was to write the Book of Feasts and come up with this, sort of co-develop this idea of like feast events, right? And so the version we have in the Game Master's Handbook is sort of a second edition of that system. It's based off of feedback from players and just sort of fine tuning things like how glory awards work and that sort of thing. But yeah, really, I mean, people, I was really happy with how people responded to the feast system when it came out, because it's designed to be a sort of story and drama generator. So, you know, you're at a feast, and you always have the option to do other things if you really want to. If you Like for instance, if your knight is famously indulgent, you have to spend the first feast round drinking as much as possible and eating as much as possible, right? You can't do anything else. But most players will opt to draw from the feast deck, and so the feast deck is going to have a card. So like for instance, I might draw oh well, here we go, more about drinking. A large keg of fine mead is brought in and opened, and then you roll your temperate versus your indulgent, and you see how that plays out, right? But it could also be something like I don't know what I got here. A serving girl drops a platter of food all over you, and you have to make a dex roll. If you fail the dex roll, you get splashed with all this food, and it affects. There's a statistic called geniality, and basically feasts are sort of a little mini competition to see which player knight can rack up the most geniality over the course of the feast. And if you manage to win, you get more glory than the other knights, right? Because people noticed you more, they talk about you more, they say, "What a swell guy," right? And you're remembered at that feast. So, having food spilled all over you, you're like, "Oh no, -3 geniality, crap." There goes my winning feast score. So, and it really is pretty remarkable, like how stories just get spun out of the feast event system. So yeah, I've never encountered anyone who didn't like the feast system, so we had to include it in the Game Master's Handbook.
Mm. One last question.
Hmm.
So sometime in the future, we'll be receiving a Noble's Handbook.
Yeah.
What can you tell us a little about that and where it is currently right now?
So so the next product in line for release is a we call it the campaign kit. It's got a GM screen, more scenarios, more game master resources. It's a companion product, obviously, to the Game Master Handbook. Poster map, a few other maps. It's just Game Master's Handbook's everything you need to run Pendragon. The campaign kit is like take it to the next level, I guess, right? But after that, we're going to release the final of the sort of core book releases, which is the Noble's Handbook, and that is going into layout as we speak. And so hoping for I would love to see it released towards the end of the year, but if we can't make that deadline just because of printing queues and everything, it would certainly be early next year. And that's like, as the name indicates, things concerned with nobility. So, if you really want to play your characters at a higher level, if you want to aspire to become a baron, it has that information in it. But, it also has all the rules for running your own estate, even just as a simple vassal knight. It has character creation rules for player ladies, and it has just a lot more information about like that kind of high level gameplay, more information on Salisbury at that level. Gosh, I mean, again, I don't think it's going to be quite as long as the core rule book or the Game Master's Handbook, but we're aiming for about 192 pages. It has an expanded family system, like if you want to just keep track of your extended family and all the problems that they cause, you can do that. Things about sieges and castles. So, and not everyone is interested in that. Like some people just want to do like questing nights and fight monsters and get glory and fight in battles, and that's totally cool. And then the Noble's Handbook is for the folks who want that kind of like I like to say like sim medieval
Political role
kind of
playing.
experience. Yeah, more in depth. So
Oh, excellent, excellent. I can't wait. So David, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about Pendragon Game Master's Handbook, and which will be out sometime, I would say, in the spring of 2025, maybe early summer.
So actually, as of when we're recording this, tomorrow, March 26th, so probably this will be in the past, you can pre-order the book and you'll get the PDF right away. And then the books themselves are actually, as we speak, on their way to our warehouses. So the minute they land in the warehouses, they're going to go out. So, I can't give a specific date, but sometime after March 26th, and I'm hoping by the time I'm at Chaosium Con in mid-April, they'll be out there in the wild.
Mm. I'll put a link in the description below once it's available for purchase.
Yeah.
So viewers and listeners, thank you for checking us out. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you soon. Take care.